So now we're going to take a little bit of a look at the third main theory regarding the DNA in the Edrick Faust case and how it managed to appear on swabs and solve the case so many years later. I'm looking at the Australian government website and it is talking about DNA, use and misuse of DNA, some of the issues. It says that DNA is corroborative evidence, so it can be used to corroborate other evidence linking someone to the crime. It does go on to say that DNA evidence can be misunderstood, especially if it's unchallenged. This article says that DNA evidence can be significantly persuasive, that this apparent certainty can be deceptive, so it can be misused and misapplied. It will not of itself solve the crime problem, although the chance of discovery may act as a deterrent. It's really highlighting that DNA evidence is part of a prosecution case, but it is not the whole prosecution case. So one of the main questions when we're looking at DNA evidence, and such a terrible crime, and the possibility of putting someone behind bars for life or the death penalty. So the question should be not just whose DNA is it, but how did the DNA get there? So we've already talked so far about natural ways that the DNA could have got there, apart from the actual involvement in the crime itself. And we've also talked about contamination and how DNA can accidentally end up somewhere that it's not supposed to be and implicate someone in a crime. Rather than the faking of a DNA profile, the more likely risk is tampering. Deliberate manipulation or tampering with DNA evidence can involve planting or altering evidence, so planting things like cigarette butts or bodily fluids. There are a few factors that make me think evidence tampering was a possibility in this case. First of all, the chain of custody and state of the packages of the samples. One of the witnesses talked about how they had to properly package the samples when they first got them because they were open and not sealed properly. If you look at the political context around this case, the fact that the Coleman-Baker Act is named after the victim in this case, which leads me to think that GBI would have a much higher motivation for solving this case, maybe just to make themselves look a little bit better, or because the initial investigation was very poor, and in a case that seems fairly obvious and there being quite a bit of evidence pointing towards one perpetrator, the fact that this ended up a cold case for such a long time is really dodgy. It seems to me to be quite convenient that all of a sudden they find new evidence and manage to solve this cold case after all these years using apparent new technology. The problem with that is that this technology isn't new, and according to the GBI crime lab policies and procedures, they actually do routinely put old evidence through CODIS when they have new technologies. So this should have been done probably more than once over the years. Yet at that time, Edrick's DNA wasn't found. So here's my theory, and of course this is just me theorizing, and this is just my opinion. I think that they looked at the time of the crime and the people who were active around that time in the justice system, and maybe looked for someone who had a similar sort of, or some sort of offence around that time that they could pin it on. And when they saw Edrick Faust's criminal history, the fact that he was involved in an incident not long after Tara's death involving a knife, completely different circumstances, but yes, involving a knife, and he was convicted of that and spent some time in prison. He also had his, I think, stepmom's address as his permanent address for mail and everything, because he moved around a lot, so that was in close vicinity to the crime scene. I've also heard that Edrick's surname is kind of known around Athens, and it has long been a target of law enforcement. So I don't know how true that is, but that is what I've read and heard. Possible that was a really good suspect that they thought would be sort of fit enough of the criteria to be the perpetrator. The cold case investigators obviously needed to get a sample from Edrick, which theoretically they could have placed within the swabs from 20-something years ago, given that the packaging was open. And we know that Edrick was followed prior to his arrest, and several saliva samples were collected without his knowledge. I guess the other problem was that they then also found Chris's DNA, which I don't know if they weren't expecting that, but you can see what Liz Bigham did to try and fix that problem. She basically gave him an out and said, look, if you change your story to fit our story, then we can let you go. Because by this point they had tunnel vision and they probably didn't want to look at the very real prospect that it actually was Chris who was the perpetrator all along. You might be wondering, how could this get through and actually happen in real life? And as disappointing as it is, I think there just are shitty people in this world who don't really care about other people, and they're more concerned about their own career or money, or I don't even know. But I mean, look at the Karen Reid trial, and that's a prime example of law enforcement just lying, making stuff up, and just completely acting horrible for no reason.